Observation over judgment. So if you've had coaching with me, I've probably talked about this with you. I talk about this a decent amount. So regarding mindset, regarding how you view the game, I think it's pretty important to try and make gameplay elements as objective and removed from emotion as possible, right? So try and avoid associating emotional, let's say, wording or thoughts about certain interactions. You might not be able to completely avoid this, but I think it sort of boils down more to our body knowing what the objective of competition is. So we don't really need to spell it out for our body, if that makes sense, right? There's going to be positive and negative outcomes where it's like, for example, you win an interaction or you lose an interaction, you take a stock or you lose a stock, but that's something that you're probably able to connect the dots more than you are giving yourself credit for. Your mind is trying too hard to assume that you really need to be discouraged from doing these things or really need to be encouraged for doing these things, right? So you're adding restrictions, you're adding barriers. But what you want to do, especially if you want to be the best player that you can be, you want to understand the game. And understanding the game is trying to break down these elements, making sure that you can understand that there might not be just one way of looking at gameplay. Objective doesn't necessarily mean that the take that you have here is the only take. Rather, you're trying to break down these interactions into essence. You're trying to understand, how does this interaction work in competitive play? What has happened when you put yourself in these situations? Because essentially your experience is going to be your proof. Everything up to this point has been your representation of gameplay, but it doesn't match anything that you saw in game, then it's pointless. There has to be some sort of justification or a way to back it up in some sense. It's not very profound, but observing your play is going to make a big difference. So how exactly are you supposed to do that? What do you look for? Which situations do you look at? And it's fairly simple. So we'll break this down into the specific interactions, and then we'll deal with how we make this actionable. How do we make this actually happen in our real gameplay? You want to learn how to break down interactions into multiple elements. So take note of the following aspects of both characters. So player one's option, what move did they choose, for example? What's the timing of the move? What's their drift if they're in the air? What's their positioning? So if it's stage positioning, maybe it's positioning relative to the opponent. Like, for example, maybe they might be in the air floating behind the opponent, but they're pretty close by. I'll just give a visual. We'll go back to that one I was referring to earlier. So the position prior to this moment was basically Rob being around here, above the opponent, slightly up left, right? And I'm going up, drifting left. So basically we're going to meet because the Rob fast falls here, falls down into my range, in which case I've put out a nair, right? So the outcome, they get hit by this option. Then the result is that they're also launched off stage. So then I can try and push this as I would like to try to. And yeah, understanding it from both sides is very important because there's two people playing. So I said, take note of the outcome. You want to think about, why did the interaction turn out this way? Was there a way in which the same options performed a little differently would result in maybe the reverse outcome, a trade, maybe the move that I chose in that situation might just whiff if the drift was a little bit different. And if there's something about performing different options, so whether that be the same move timed differently, it could be something like putting like a fastball aerial on someone's shield versus not fast fall, or maybe doing a double jump to stall for time a little bit. Is there counterplay to these different options? Basically, that leads into if there's another option that could potentially have addressed the situation for the one that lost the interaction. Understanding what the purpose of the options chosen, in understanding the pros and cons of that, is what's going to help you identify alternative scenarios. Because if there's pros to it, then there's a reason to go for it. If there's cons, maybe you want to consider if there's another option that could maybe address those cons. Something that could, let's say, if it covers spot dodge, if there's something prior to it, a move that comes out, then what would be a different option that instead of accounting for spot dodge would hit that prior portion, right? Or that would keep the player safe from this mash. There's a lot to take into account there, though. I mentioned that all of this is quite a bit. So VOD review is usually your first step because you get the chance to pause and dissect the interaction. But at the end of the day, this has to be applied to a real game at some point, which means that this has to be applied in real time. So it sounds complicated. How are you going to do this? So for real-time observation, let's say we're in friendlies or we're just sort of practicing, right? We want to determine an interaction that we're going to focus on. This can sometimes be something that you find yourself struggling with, or maybe you're playing a match and you notice that you're having trouble in this particular area. So if I were to simplify what I said beforehand, you would take quick note of what you were doing at the time the interaction happened. So again, you would want to care about things like your option, your drift or positioning, and what your opponent was doing. From there, that's where you want to leave it. you've set up the building blocks to yourself and explained what just happened. So let's try and address this a few other ways. So again, maybe it's hard for some people to recall the specific situations. So for example, when I'm thinking about these situations, there'll be times where I can recall almost kind of like a snapshot in time. What was I doing at the time? What were they doing at the time, sort of thing. So I can sometimes do that mid-game, or otherwise maybe I'll be thinking about that after the game. But if you can't do that, like, because I don't know if that's fairly common, but in case it's not common, then we have other ways to deal with it. So we want to think about maybe other ways that we might be able to identify how we were playing. So your mental state or your emotive state, basically how you were feeling at the time, can tend to give you a lot of information as well. If you notice or watch yourself back in a VOD or something when you're playing scared, you can try and take note of the options that you choose, and it gives you a potential clue into how you might be playing at that time. And otherwise, if observing that sort of stuff is too intensive to do while you're playing, then instead, I think it's better to just end up focusing your attention on the match. So this is eventually going to be the end goal of playing these real-time observations anyways, but if you're having trouble observing to begin with here, then there's no point in sidetracking your brain. And so instead, I find it can sometimes be handy to find something that's trivial or it seems like an unimportant detail and just focus your attention on it, just so that you're paying attention to that match. So you can do like in-game music. You could focus on something like the textures of your opponent's characters. Maybe you focus on the blade trail of the opponent's sword if you're playing against a swordy or something like that. I think it would be helpful if you put the focus less on your character and more on other aspects. It's basically forcing your attention on the opponent. So when you narrow down onto very specific features, it's a level of attentiveness that you might not normally have, especially something like, for example, the sword trails. It might subconsciously get you a little bit more aware of the exact range that an opponent has. So that's part of the reasoning behind what I've suggested. So at the end of all the preparations, all your practice, all your thinking, you're going to have to use this information in your sets. Basically, at some point, there has to be enough data for you here, because once you enter a set, it's test time. So if you're going into that and basically looking at a question, trying to review your notes, when you have like half a second or less to deal with the interaction that's coming up, basically you have to start relying on your understanding of the game, your subconscious representation. So you do want to focus your mind on the game then, and you have to trust yourself to work through the interactions and to subconsciously adapt to some of those nuances. All of this stuff should be done ahead of time, because once it's game time, you don't have time to be figuring this stuff out. The only thing you have time to do is to apply these things. But again, I think people need to trust themselves more than they realize. Mental thoughts in a set or analyzing the interactions can come into play, but the bulk of your regular play is going to be relying on what's natural and instinctual to you. So you shouldn't want to fight it. That's a conclusion I came to over time myself after trying fairly hard to think about every interaction, but ultimately that's pretty tiring. It's pretty slow. I think it's a lot easier if you can make that all internalized. It actually is autopilot. It's a smart autopilot. I think people have the impression that autopilot has to be entirely bad, but if your subconscious game can still adapt, then that is in a sense good autopilot. The type of autopilot that we want to avoid is when we aren't picking up on these things and we're just pressing buttons. In that sense, that sort of autopilot might not be the best, but I think part of the issue at hand there is more so the focus portion, understanding what to look for, or otherwise maybe not having a full understanding of the situations that are contributing to your downfall. Good autopilot frees up mental stack that you can use to look for other stuff. That's part of the portion there. I would tend to agree, is that you don't have to expend so much brain power on just playing. That feels very inefficient. I know a lot of people who basically will feel kind of burnt out after a bracket. I know a lot of that can be based on people's attention. It can also be based off of the mindset that they have to focus like that with the thinking. But we want to be reducing the amount that I'd say consciously think about these sort of things. It's basically having like a backseat driver. So instead, let yourself drive. Okay? But yeah. All right, we'll wrap up here for today then.